Welcome, everybody, to the first colloquium of the new academic year. It's exciting to begin with a new cohort of fellows who are just brilliant with amazing projects. Let's see. Today, we have a guest speaker, Professor Randall Kennedy, and I'm going to quickly cede the podium to Professor Sandra Susan Smith, who's the Daniel and Florence Guggenheim Professor of Criminal Justice and Faculty Director of the Program in Criminal Justice Policy and Management. She's also the Director of the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy here at the Kennedy School, and she's a Carol K. Forsheimer Professor at Radcliffe. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation, and this is my first time here, so this is wonderful. Yeah, won't be the last. So good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce Randall Kennedy at today's Fellows Colloquium here at the Du Bois Institute at the Hutchins Center. A formidable thinker, legal scholar, and law professor, Randall Kennedy is a Michael R. Klein Professor of Law at Harvard University, where he teaches courses on contracts, criminal law, and the regulation of race relations. His teachings, writings, and his work as a public intellectual are crucial, complexly argued, and unique interventions in the most important contemporary conversations on race, culture, and the law. In addition to being a much sought-after speaker, Randall Kennedy is a prolific, formidable author and writes across a range of publication forms for both scholarly and general audiences. He has published too numerous to count here, opinion pieces, articles, chapters, and books. Among the latter are Race, Crime, and the Law, which earned the 1998 Robert F. Kennedy Book Award, For Discrimination, Race, Affirmative Action, and the Law, The Persistence of the Color Line, Racial Politics and the Obama Presidency, Sellout, The Politics of Racial Betrayal, Interracial Intimacies, Sex, Marriage, Identity, and Adoption, and Nigger, The Strange Career of a Troublesome Word. Contracts, Happiness, and Heartbreak, a required class text, is recently in its third edition. As you can well imagine, his titles frequently reflect among the most provocative, nuanced, and still timely, smart discussions that one will encounter in the intellectual history of race in this country. Born in Columbia, South Carolina, Randall Kennedy attended St. Albans School, Princeton University, Oxford University, and Yale Law School. He served as a law clerk to Judge J. Skelly Wright and to Justice Thurgood Marshall. He is a member of the Bar of the District of Columbia, the Bar of the United States Supreme Court, the American Law Institute, the American Philosophical Association, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is also trustee emeritus of Princeton University. His recently published book, Say It Loud, am I supposed to say it loud? Is that the intention? So Say It Loud, on race, law, history, and culture, is a collection of his essays from the last several years. And covers such topics as Black Lives Matter, critical race theory, and anti-racism on college campuses, as well as the legacies of such figures as Thurgood Marshall and Frederick Douglass. Now, it is rare for me to cite John McWhorter in a good way, but the New York Times reviewer says about Say It Loud that despite its title, as in almost everything about his views on race in America, Kennedy is both resolutely temperate and probably right. For once, I would agree. Please welcome Randall Kennedy.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for that very generous introduction. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to be talking with you about a project that I'm wrestling with. I'd say for about the last 9 years, I've been working on a book. It's tentatively titled From Protest to Law, Triumphs and Defeats and Struggles for Racial Justice. It's a book that addresses the following question: how did protests against racial injustice in the mid-20th century change American law? That's what I try to, that's the question I attempt to answer. And I've been working on this for a long time. I'd say I'm 85% done, but that leaves a lot. Most of this book is about litigation, casework. It's mainly about the main legal developments in the Second Reconstruction. So it's about the uprooting, at least the legal uprooting, of de jure segregation. It's about the attack on private racial discrimination through the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's about the attack on racial disfranchisement in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It's about the attack on racial discrimination in housing, Civil Rights Act of 1968. And most of the people that I deal with in this book are legislators, they're litigators, they are lobbyists. Those are the people. And most of the people I deal with are people who are seeking to influence those in authority so that those in authority will change things to make the United States a more, a racially just place. Okay, and that's what I mainly focus upon. And because I mainly focus upon people who are engaged in litigation, who are engaged in lawmaking, I'm mainly involved with people who are reformers, who are self-conscious reformers. They want in to the American system. They don't want to overthrow the American system. They want into the American system. Okay. Well, fine. But of course, that's not the only, it wasn't, people were doing other things in the period between, let's say, 1950 to 1970. There were some people the people that I'm mainly engaged in are people who were not involved in any sort of violence. In fact, most of them eschewed violence. But there were people who were engaged in, or who were certainly said they were willing to be engaged in violent activity, and there were some who were engaged in violent activity. And that's where I want to focus on in these remarks. And I want I'll be very interested in your reactions, because as I've talked with people, over the years, it's precisely this issue that I'm going to talk with you about that I have gotten the most negative feedback. And so I want to grapple with that, and I look forward to your comments.
We're happy to join the band.
There you go. So I'm going to talk about two aspects of the issue of violence. First, I want to talk about what some refer to as the tradition of black armed defense. So here I'm going to, in the last, I'd say, 20 years in the historiography of the civil rights movement, there have been a number of books that have championed people who said that they were willing to pick up the gun and defend themselves, defend themselves violently if need be. And one organization that has really become very prominent in the historiography in the last 10, 20 years, the Deacons for Defense. Deacons for Defense, a group from Louisiana. They existed between approximately 1964 and 1968. And their basic thing was, we're going to defend ourselves. They were started, it was an organization started by veterans. Many of them had been veterans. They knew about guns. They said, we're going to pick up the gun, and if people fire on us, we're going to fire back. And they provided escorts to people in the Deep South who were engaged in various sorts of civil rights activity. There was something of a controversy involving the Deacons for Defense in the march the march that James Meredith began, the March Against Fear. And after James Meredith was shot, the civil rights forces continued the march, but the question became, well, there were some people who wanted the Deacons for Defense to be there to help defend them. And there was a big fight about that, but they joined in. Okay, there's a book, sort of the leading book about the Deacons for Defense. It's a book by a historian, Lance Hill. It's called The Deacons for Defense, Armed Resistance in the Civil Rights Movement. It's published by University of North Carolina Press. Very, sort of a conventionally cited book. And he really lauds the Deacons for Defense. And one of the reasons why I think his book is important is something he says near the end. He says, violence in the form of armed self-defense played a fundamental role in uprooting segregation and economic and political discrimination from 1963 to 1965. Only after the threat of black violence emerged did civil rights legislation move to the forefront of the national agenda. Only after the Deacons appeared were the civil rights laws effectively enforced and the obstruction of terrorists and complicit law enforcement agencies neutralized. That's a heck of a claim. I mean, he's, really, hey, these people really did important stuff. And people ought to, take note of that. And much of his book is a complaint about the civil rights literature. He says, people never even heard of these people. And they don't get much ink. And he thinks that this is, a real important oversight. Now, for me, one difficulty with this book, and I think some of the literature that has, sort of stemmed from it, is I'm concerned about whether I should actually credit the statements made in terms of the history. So, for instance, throughout the book, there will be references to people who, will say that they carried arms, or that they went to somebody's house. We heard that the Ku Klux Klan was coming, so we went to so-and-so's house, and we were waiting for them. A lot of instances like that. I carried guns, and we were waiting for them. Or they came, white night riders came, and they were riding off, and we shot at them. Well, if that's the way it was, fine. That's the way it was. The book begins with a scenario of a standoff between a guy who was in the White Citizens Council in Washington Parish in Louisiana, and one of the Deacons for Defense. And there's a description, and the author of our book, the book said, the Deacons for Defense and Justice had faced death and never flinched. Okay? Now, when one turns to the sources, that sounds really interesting. I'd like to know maybe more about this. What does one find? One finds, well, I interviewed so-and-so. The very person who, stood face to face, facing down the Klan, or who took the shot, or who was there the night, waiting for the Klan, Well, I mean, that could be true. It's not like oral history isn't useful. It is useful if it's corroborated and it's true. On the other hand, there is such a thing as, dimmed memories. There is such a thing as, for 20 years, I wish that night I had, gone to the house and had taken a shot. And there is such a thing as longing. There's such a thing as longing. There's such a thing as talking to an audience and an audience wants to hear something, and you give the audience what you want the audience to hear. In the book, we hear the following: the real history of the organization, the Deacons for Defense, resides in the collective memories of its members. I think there's, the collective memories of its members are important, but not to be accepted at face value. It seems to me that people who really want to, grapple with this terrain, what about corroboration? Is there some account somewhere about this? And if there's not, it seems to me that needs to be acknowledged. Here's a story, here's what somebody said, but of course, people say all sorts of things. Let me give you another example of what concerns me. Here I'm going to go to what I think many people would view as the leading book about the Black Panther Party. Black Against Empire, The History and Politics of the Black Panther Party, Joshua Bloom and Waldo Martin Jr. Early in the book, there are two scenarios offered about the Panthers. And in the first one, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale are stopped by some police, and there's a confrontation. And I'll read you a paragraph. This is a paragraph. Newton took the shotgun from Seale, leapt out of the car, and jacked a round of ammunition into the chamber. He shouted, "Now, who in the hell do you think you are, you big redneck bastard? You rotten fascist swine, you bigoted racist? You come into my car trying to brutalize me and take my property away from me? Go for your gun and you're a dead pig." The officer lifted his hands away from his gun while Seale and Hutton jumped out of the passenger side of the car. Seale pulled back the hammer on his .45. The officer backed away from Newton toward his car where he radioed for backup, and then it continues. Okay. It's certainly a very grabby scene. Certainly a very dramatic, grabby scene. And, might it have happened? It might have happened. Again, if one, turns to the footnotes, what's the reference? Where'd you get the information from what this? An interview with, Bobby Seale. And then, Seize the Day, Bobby Seale's, memoir. And I'm not going to repeat. It seems that's not enough. There's another scene very similar, and I must say, when I read this, I immediately thought of. It sounded to me suspiciously like a movie scene. I mean, it just did. I mean, it's sort of, I could imagine some of my favorite movie characters playing this. I'm sure that I would, I'd pay to go see it. I'd like seeing it. But this, it seems to me, is, we're talking about a very different thing. One more thing before we proceed, and here's what I think is in part going on. There's a book, a very interesting book, by a guy named Nicholas Johnson. It's called Negroes and the Gun, The Black Tradition of Arms. Now, Professor Nicholas Johnson is a professor of law at Fordham, and one of the things that really grabs him that he writes about is the Second Amendment. And he's a strong, he's a champion of the Second Amendment and a champion of the idea of black people owning guns and being armed. And basically, his basic shtick is, we have a history of the state not defending black people. Black people have to defend themselves. And he's very involved in current day Second Amendment litigation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, he's written this book. The book, a large part of it, getting to the present day struggles over the Second Amendment, is about sort of historical instances of blacks and self-defense, the use of guns. And his introduction, I found very useful. He's talking about black people involved in, the Black freedom movement. And he says at one point, there is a palpable yearning for something more than the images of Negroes in church clothes, flattened by baton charges, attacked by dogs, and sometimes hanged from tree limbs. Many of these people were heroes, but they were also victims, and that leaves us unfulfilled, grateful for their sacrifice, but still not fully proud. The question lingers, where is our Leonidas? Where is our classic champion who meets force with force, even in the face of long odds? Some may find an answer within the black tradition of arms. Now, my reading of this, I think he's onto something. I think there is a tremendous longing. I think there's a tremendous longing from people who look at the history of the brutalization of black people, read about brutalization, and are really longing for, when do we get our innings? And that phrase, where is our Leonidas? Leonidas, the Spartan who with his 300 faced, the Persian Empire. And they went down, but they went down, it was glorious. And I think actually that there is a real yearning for that. Now, one question I have, one thing I would say is, actually, Leonidas, there's a lot good about Leonidas. I'll give him his props. Leonidas had nothing on Medgar Evers. Leonidas had nothing on Martin Luther King Jr. Where's our Leonidas? We have our Leonidases. I don't see why we have to, sort of go make up a history. Let's take what we've got and be as precise as we can about it. I don't see the need for what seems to be this. I'm very skeptical about a lot, frankly, of this history. Let me go to my second point. And the second point has to do not so much, what I've been talking about is a matter of description. I'm worried about the description of this, that's been handed to us about this tradition of, black self-defense, armed self-defense. And, what people were, said that they did. So that was descriptive. The next thing I want to talk about is normative, the question of, where does one stand with respect to this? And here I want to talk about riots. Now, I use my word advisedly. I know that there's a political thing about riots, and I've already tipped my hand a little bit by having used it. Riot versus, rebellion versus insurgency versus, disturbance versus, you're supposed to, rebellion, I think, is what folks are, progressive folks are supposed to say. I use them all, including riot. Now, just so we can all sort of be on all fours with this, what does federal statutory law say about riot? It's not like we have to, go and, talk past one another. There's various definitions of riot. In fact, many states have laws in which they've defined riot. Here's a law, 1968 Civil Rights Act defines rioting as an act of violence by one or more persons, part of an assemblage. One or more persons shall constitute a clear and blah, blah, blah. It's an act of one or more persons engaged in activity that damages or injures the property of other persons or that injures them physically. We're talking about a sort of collective violence. We're talking of, and to be just more particular about it, we're talking about people smashing store windows, absconding with wares, liquor, food, furniture, clothes, diapers. We're talking about setting stores afire. We're talking about pelting police and firefighters with rocks, punching holes in water hoses, and occasionally beating people and, taking shots at people. I mean, rioting. Now, there's been a considerable amount of work on rioting in the past, years, and I don't want to. Here's the question that I want to pose so that we can, again, I want to have interaction. Question: did the riots, rebellions, disorders, uprising, revolts advance or hinder movement toward racial justice? And, where does one stand on that? Now, there are people who take the position that, on balance, the riots were beneficial. And the argument for the riots being beneficial basically was, listen, there had been, a lot of civil rights reform, but the civil rights reform really did not touch, adequately, satisfactorily, people in the, urban areas who were hurting. And people wanted to, and, people felt like they're going to have to do something different to make themselves heard. And they did make themselves heard. They did make themselves heard, and the argument would be that the people who made themselves heard actually got something, from it. Resources were pried loose through rioting. Now, I think there's something to that. It's true that, some responses to rioting were risibly negligible. I'm thinking about places, and there were some cities where the municipal authorities handed out tickets to baseball games, and free hot dogs. Obviously that's ridiculous. But there were other things that were more substantial. After the Watts riot, President Lyndon Johnson declares, "We must eliminate the deep-seated causes of riots. Long-term answers must and will be found." Hey, that's something. And it's the President of the United States saying, you've got my attention. That's not a little thing. His response was not, idiosyncratic. Many officials clearly paid more attention to needy black neighborhoods after rather than before the rioting. The Federal Office of Economic Opportunity funds per poor family in Los Angeles increased more than six-fold in the year following the Watts riot. Rochester, New York experienced rioting in 1964 and 1967. It is no coincidence that the largest anti-poverty outlays in that city were in 1965, after the 64 riot, and 1968, the year after the 67 riot. The Secretary of HUD, Housing and Urban Development, Robert Weaver, the great Robert Weaver, remarked in 1966, at the time of the enactment of the Model Cities legislation, quote, "I am sure that this law would never have come out of the Congress if it were not for the riots." Later, he remarked that the race riots aroused conscience or guilt or fear and resulted in action. We needed something to galvanize society and government. It's Robert Weaver. Robert Weaver, I respect Robert Weaver. He was a very knowledgeable commentator.
A black man.
He was a black man, yeah, he was a black man too. Now, I hear that, and I think that needs to be taken on board. I'm not persuaded. In terms of the politics of the situation on the ground, the thing that's sort of grabs me the most is the fact that, is the claim. I can't say it's the fact. It's the argument. It's no more than an argument that the long, hot summers of the late 1960s helped open the door to the right-wing reaction that is still part of our life. The election of 1968 was a very close election. And Richard Nixon, his main campaign plank, law and order. Now, could it, I'm looking back. It's always, you always know a lot more looking back, so it seems to me that if you're going to sort of criticize people, you can't just look back. You have to ask, well, what were people saying at the time? There were people at the time who were saying this rioting is not good for the Black freedom movement. Who were some of these people? Dick Gregory in Watts just happened to be in Los Angeles at the very beginning of the riots. Dick Gregory gets up on a car and tries to calm down a riotous mob. He is shot. Yeah, Dick Gregory was shot. They had to take him over to the hospital. The people just, shut up, boom, Dick Gregory. In Harlem, in the 1964 riots, Bayard Rustin, same thing. This is bad for us. This is bad for the movement. We need to do something else. Booed, shouted down. Get out of here. Martin Luther King Jr. What was Martin Luther King Jr. saying in 1964, 1965, 1966? Very strong, holding back not at all with respect to the riots. Nowadays, you see people say, Martin Luther King Jr. said that, the riots was the voice of people who were unheard. That's what you hear over and over. That was one sentence. He said that. Yeah, he said that. After he said that, he went on for pages talking about how bad this was and how this was going to seed the ground for reaction. And he was right. Now, again, it's only an argument. I mean, life is complicated. You're talking about, who won a political, who won the president. There were lots of things. There was a war in Vietnam. The Democrats had the presidency for a while. It may very well have been that, even if there had not been riots, we would, the right wing would have been right-wing takeover of the federal government. I mean, so I'm not saying that this is altogether clear. I can only make an argument. I think there's a strong argument to be made that the riots were part of that baleful stew that brought in, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and the sequelae that, have made up the last 50 years of, American life. But there's another thing that's on my mind, and I'll state this and then I'll subside. I don't know. I can't tell you, definitely what all of the consequences of the riots were, because of course the riots were connected to lots of other things, and we can't figure out in any strong way causation. There's 1,000 things going on, lots of things. So I could just make an argument. But there is something where I can be more definite. And that has to do with a judgment about the moral quality of actions. And here, I must say, I'm taken aback by some of the things that have been published over the last decade with respect to the riots. So you'll have people who will talk about somebody going into a store, dousing the floor with gasoline, lighting a match, the store goes up. It's not just the store that goes up. It's not just the store that goes up. The apartment over the store goes up. The house next to the store goes up. Blocks are incinerated. And the response is, well, you got to understand that the people who did this were deprived of education, deprived of jobs, they were oppressed. Absolutely. Yeah, all that's true. All of that's true. They also did something, it seems to me, that was totally dastardly and ought not be, I think it was criminal then. And in terms of trying to understand and make judgments about people's action, for me, no, that was bad. And it seems to me that, one lesson that is in here, oppressed people can do terrible things. And oppressed people do terrible things. Hurt people hurt all the time. And so, this is a place where it seems to me, again, in terms of the deployment of violence, more care needs to be taken. By the way, I should say, I'm not a pacifist. I'm not a pacifist. I believe, in some instances, that's right. Pick up the gun. But one must always, it seems to me, be very careful. And in all of our actions, we need to be aware of the morality of our actions and hold people, including ourselves, to account. And I would say that about the conduct of the people that pursued the second Reconstruction as well. All right, that's enough.
Beautiful.
Back and forth.
Randy, that was great. Randy, that was great. I love hearing you talk. I wish I could be your student or co-teach a course with you in the law school sometime. That would be fun. Two things. Negroes with Guns, Robert Williams, 1957. I'd like your reflections about him and that. And of course, as you know, he went into exile in Cuba and had a regular radio broadcast called Radio Free Dixie. So that Robert Williams, and he published this book about his philosophy, the relationship between Robert Williams and the Deacons of Defense, for example, and the Black Panthers, et cetera. That's the first thing. But the second thing that hadn't occurred to me actually until literally 10 minutes ago is that it would be interesting for you to, and maybe you have reflected on this already, think about the relationship between this strand of argument or thinking or philosophical stance within the Black tradition about the necessity of self-defense or proto-action, opposite of self-defense, when you're going on the offensive, with using guns, but the relationship between that discourse and what I call the romance of serving in the military. And for those of you who don't know, there is a long and consistent tradition of black leaders arguing that our people perhaps never can be thought of as equal citizens until we demonstrate, quote unquote, manhood on the battlefield. And this goes back to the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and God knows the American Civil War. Even Du Bois, as an infamous example, is that Du Bois did a complete reversal and endorsed black participation in World War I, even though everyone knew Woodrow Wilson was the biggest racist since Andrew Johnson.
Close ranks.
Close ranks. His editorial in the crisis, which received a lot of pushback from other black intellectuals, and Du Bois was in pursuit of a captainship in the military, which he never got, and I think he was very disappointed about that. But how would you, have you thought about that, this, you know, Frederick Douglass's face, give a band in, I wish I had memorized it, in the coat of blue with the buttons and the eagles, and then who can say we're not really Americans? Who can say we don't deserve the perquisites of citizenship? That is the exemplification of military prowess and self-defense and the use of guns legitimized by the state, which we fought to have the right to engage in.
Okay, so Negroes with Guns by Robert Williams. That would be a, I mean, I could just as well have, he too is a person who over the past 20 years has, you know, risen dramatically. I mean, you know, 50 years ago, he would have been a very marginal character. Nowadays, if you go to, you know, people who write about this, you know, the second Reconstruction, Robert Williams is a very important figure, and Negroes with Guns is lauded. Again, you know, I have a lot of respect. I have a lot of respect for Robert Williams. He was in a very tough, you know, tough circumstances. He did what he could. But people have, in my view, exaggerated very much his significance, you know, and have sought to make of his book Negroes with Guns, you know, sort of try to make it seem as though it was a, you know, a deep, you know, philosophical treatise that everybody should read. No, I mean, so that's, I mean, I think that the treatment of Robert Williams fits. That certainly will be part of my discussion.
So what is the next level of analysis? You've engaged in a description of a trend. So what is the next level of your analysis? You've engaged in a description of a trend. Why? You know, with historiography, the next level is always, why is this phenomenon happening?
Well, again, I think that you know, why is it that, well, there are various things. Some are just practical. So I think, you know, people who are academics, you know, if you're looking to, you know, write a PhD, if you're looking to, you know, get that first job, if you're looking to, you know, sort of be high in the pecking order, you got to say something new. And you've got to, right? I mean, you can't just say that what so-and-so said 30 years ago was really good. So you say something new. And so, you know, how do you say something new? Well, you know, so-and-so has been overlooked and was really important. And I'm going to write my book about so-and-so. Now, again, I don't want to overdo it, but do I think that's part of the story? Yeah, I think that's part of the story. I think part of the story of, making way in a literature is to, sort of find new people to laud. Or, of course, the flip is to downgrade people who have been lauded. And by the way, I think both are going on in the historiography of the Second Reconstruction, the historiography of the Civil Rights Revolution. There's some people, the cool kids now, in many circles, the cool kids are Malcolm X, post-1965 Stokely Carmichael, certainly the Panthers. I'll just stop, those are the cool kids. The kids who are not cool are Roy Wilkins, Whitney Young, Martin Luther King, Thurgood Marshall. Now, one of the things that's sort of, one of the calling cards for, my project is I flip that. And that is, for me, this has been really important because, in a way, this project of mine is sort of, in a way, the story of my life. I was born in 1954, and I had the great privilege of knowing some of the people I'm going to be writing about. For me, I have found over the past 10 years, probably the biggest thing that's happened, a total switch. For me, cool kids, Thurgood Marshall, Roy Wilkins. People talk about the Panthers. I think the Panthers did some, I think they did some good things. But I tell you what, you got a problem. Can you say that, can you go to a branch of the Black Panther Party? Oh, no, I'm sorry, it doesn't exist anymore. The NAACP, for all you want to say about it, you can call up the NAACP. And by the way, another thing, and what's its name? National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So, one of the things I'm a bit concerned about, I think, I teach this, I use this with test balloons, with teaching, and the students, they're very polite to me and everything, but I do get eyeball rolling. I really do. I get eyeball rolling because, for me, I don't. Colored's all right with me. Negro was all right with me. I don't have any problem with Negro.
And black people off stage of a certain generation use all these terms interchangeably in casual discourse.
Well, I'm of a certain age, and I use it in formal discourse. Yeah. But getting apart from that, so one of the issues is, you asked me, why. I think part of it is ideological. Part of it has to do with who do you think actually advanced the ball better. And frankly, looking back, I think that the cool kids, as I put it, the people who advanced the ball the best, in my view, were again from King to John Lewis,
Vernon?
Yes. He was important lawyer. People,
No, but he integrated the corporate boardrooms on Wall Street.
I wasn't thinking so much about that. I was thinking of the sort of the earlier. But the point is, my point is, a lot has to do with ideological preferences and what one thinks of, who, it's in a way the making of, who's the hero. And I suppose that one of the aims of my project is to elevate the reputations of people who I think have actually been demoted, and, you know, frankly, demote the reputations of some people who I think have been elevated in a way that I don't think, you know, is warranted. Let me stop there.
No, but and the military.
The military, I mean, I think we've already, I think that there is, I think, you know, in your question you answered it actually. I think that in a Black American life, and I think it shows up in lots of different areas, there is a deep, I mean, the scars of racism run so deeply. I mean, if one thinks about, you know, what was one of the justifications of slavery? One of the justifications of slavery were black people are natural slaves. How do we know that black people are natural slaves? Because they are enslavable.
And don't rebel.
And, well, that was what, you know, different from Native Americans. And I think that there is still a grappling, I think there is still a tremendous, I mean, when you think about, you know, black people on the auction block, when you think about, you know, Malcolm X talking about how he hated every cell of, you know, the rapist blood that was in him. Oh, I think that runs deep, and I think that people are, you know, why didn't we do more? Just like by then, you know, black people are just like other people, just like Jews are haunted by the Holocaust. You know, why didn't we do this? You know, black people are still haunted by that, and I think that that shows up in various ways, and I think it shows up in my subject to some degree.
Thank you. No? You can't hear me now? Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much. This is such an interesting talk that you've given. You started with talking about calling into question the tradition of armed resistance in the Black experience, and then noting a couple of oral histories and historians using oral histories. Part of the question is, are you questioning like the validity of oral histories? Are you thinking that historians are not using resources available to corroborate what's being said? How are you thinking about other experiences of armed resistance where it is corroborated? Here I'm thinking about Gloria Richardson and the Cambridge movement in Maryland, where the National Guard is in the car riding through the neighborhood, and Black folks are shooting at these cars that are terrorizing Black communities. How are you thinking more about this kind of tradition? I guess I'm wondering, are you calling it into question, or are you just kind of calling into question how historians or other scholars have talked about the tradition? Are you seeing other experiences where deployment of violence is useful, right? So like if we think about Reconstruction, right? Like, so not the second Reconstruction, but look at someone like Ida B. Wells, who says that the best way to stop lynching is for white folks to know that they run the risk of also getting exactly what they put out, right? So she says that a Winchester, a rifle needs to have a place of honor in every Black home. I guess I'm wondering how you are kind of thinking through this idea of the tradition of armed resistance. And then in terms of this question of riots, rebellions, you seem to be using the terms interchangeably, as you said. The question I have for you is, when you are looking at these sources, are you noticing the targets of collective violence in these Black communities? Mm-hmm. Meaning, are you noticing when Black folks are skipping a store? Are they rioting, quote unquote, at the library? Are they experiencing or deploying violence in churches in their communities? What are you seeing in terms of Black folks deploying violence in the so-called riots?
Okay, couple things. One, first, I'm not questioning the usefulness of oral history so long as it is handled in a careful, disciplined way. history, as far as I'm concerned, can be a very useful source so long as one is careful with it. What I'm against is undisciplined, sentimental use of oral history. Somebody, said something, and therefore it happened. No, and I think people have to be very, I think people have to be extremely careful. Let's take a person, Taylor Branch. Taylor Branch, very significant, written, very useful stuff. But in my view, his use of oral history is, all too often dubious, in the sense that you talk with somebody who's 60 years old, you say, this happened when you were 30 years old, tell me about it. Well, all sorts of things have happened in those 30 years, including, by the way, the 60-year-old knowing, what has happened, knowing what people now view as a good thing. Memory is tainted. And so one has to be aware of that. And so if one is aware of that, if one's careful about it, if one acknowledges to the reader, here's what so-and-so said, but, take this into account, take this into account, take this into account, that's fine. But simply saying, I talked with so-and-so and so-and-so said, I said this 30 years ago, I'm glad to hear that that's what the person said. Don't expect me to believe that that was necessarily, the case. Now, on your issue of I think that, yes, there were instances when, black people resorted to arms and violence in the Second Reconstruction. Sure, I'm sure there were instances. Was it fundamental? I mean, was it fundamental? Was it central? Was it the thing that was making things happen? No, it was marginal. And that's, my beef. It was marginal. It was there. And, you might like it. You might, salute the people who were engaged in it. But the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the Civil Rights Act of 1960, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Open Housing Act of 1968 did not come from that. Now, so that's my point. As for, you mentioned, here's one. You mentioned the people the skipping of stores. I do talk about that. So, one of the things in the sort of the iconography of rioting was the Soul Brother sign. Soul Brother. And you see Soul Brother and, black-owned store, so don't burn me out. I think that the Soul Brother sign, I devote a page or two to this, because I think the Soul Brother sign is an interesting sign. I think that raises an interesting question. The question I think it raises is, well, first of all, if you have a Soul Brother sign up, that is a signal that you are aware that there are people who are burning down places because of the race of the owner or manager of the store. So there's the Soul Brother. The person who put Soul Brother up is saying, I'm a Soul Brother, I'm black, don't mess with my spot, okay? Now, if you're going to mess with somebody else's spot, go and mess with somebody else's spot, but don't mess with my spot, because I'm...
Is it race, or is it how they're treating the people in the community?
Oh,
I think we have to do... we are having a conversation, so excuse me if I'm being rude.
That's no, you're not being rude at all. No, it's the soul brother. It's not. No, it's race. It's race. Soul brother. You're going to tell me that they're not putting up a sign saying, "Don't burn me out. I've treated people well." No, it says soul brother. Furthermore, question. In different places, there was. It's not like the soul brother sign was effective everywhere. There were a bunch of places where the soul brother sign did not prevent you from having your store burned down. There were plenty of places where that happened. But there's another thing going on here, which is, I think, it raises an interesting question about the person who actually puts up the soul brother sign. And I'm not, I mean, what the heck? If I owned a store or I owned a barbershop in 1968, I'm from Washington, D.C. I remember the riot in Washington, D.C. in 1968. If I had been on, 14th Street, 14th and U in 1968, if my, parents owned owned a shop, they may very well have put up Soul Brother. That does not. I still think it raises an interesting ethical issue, though. I really do. I think it raises an ethical issue. So that means it seems to me it does make the person who puts up the Soul Brother sign somewhat complicit in what happens. Seems to me.
Burn the white people, but not
Yes, burn the white people. Yes, burn the white people, but not me.
I hope you include in your book the famous picture of there was, I think, a Korean shopkeeper put the sign up, "Me Soul Brother too."
Okay.
I think it was in Watts.
No, I think.
They did not burn the shop, right? Yeah.
But
Goddamn, you want to be black that bad? You can have it.
Others.
Professor.
I can hear you.
So, two related questions. In terms of thinking about which helped to, I think you said, kick the ball further down the court, which efforts were more successful. So I'm not speaking to which are the cool groups and how that's changed over time. I'm not concerned with that. But I am concerned with this way in which you're characterizing it as these very different kind of movements, one perhaps far more effective at, I guess, creating a space for black folks to achieve some kind of advancement or mobility. And I'm having a hard time not thinking about whatever advancements that have happened as being somehow linked. So is it not possible that in the face of black folks who are willing to take up arms and be violent where necessary, that those who are positioning themselves as peaceful look a lot more, and so that allows for an opening. And on top of that, it allows for an opening that is predominantly for middle-class blacks, right? So we create an infrastructure for their mobility, affirmative action that allows many of us to go on to college, et cetera, I was about to say fancy jobs, but it wasn't fancy at the time. While also creating infrastructures of imprisonment for those who are in places like Oakland. So that you have both. You do have progress because of violence in part, but you also have the backlash, which is the huge investments in the criminal legal system on all levels, which primarily draws in what the communities of color, predominantly black and poor, so that they're connected, that you can't really do the one or the other, that it's because of this that allows for us to be here, but it also really allowed for or created the space where folks who were interested in preserving white supremacy created institutions like the criminal legal system. So can you help me understand?
I think there's a lot in what you say. And, there is an argument that, there's people who, actually try to test it out empirically. So, I think his name is Professor Haynes. I think he's a sociologist who, in the 60s tried to do a study of which groups, when did groups get money? When did groups get money from big foundations? And his finding was, his conclusion was, groups, sort of your sort of mainstream, more pacific groups got more money, and when, in the aftermath of rioting and when things were getting real woolly, it was basically, hey, let's give some money to these people because they're sort of acting okay, as opposed to these people who, because we're scared of these people. And he wrote up there's a book, and he sort of let's take a look at the budgets, let's take a look at where the money came from. I think there's, and I said, I think that there is something to that. And you mentioned affirmative action. Let me just read it. Again, it's difficult. It's difficult to trace all of the riot's ramifications. Some emerged in contexts far afield from the ghettos. In a careful study of student admissions at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, Jerome Carabel concluded that anxieties generated by the riots played a big role in pushing administrators to implement reforms that enabled larger numbers of blacks to gain admission to those coveted avenues of influence and upward mobility. The presence of black students at the leading Ivies grew during the early 1960s, but it grew astonishingly in the second half of the decade. What changed, Carabel argues, quote, was the growth of disruptive activity both on and off campus. He identified the violent responses to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. as particularly important, maintaining that the surge in black enrollments in 1969 constituted dramatic testimony to the power of the riots to alter established practices. It seems to me, and he goes on.
The guns at Cornell.
The guns. So I think that the flanking, the idea of the more, the people threatening violence, opening up territory for others. I mean, we've seen this before. I mean, in the 19th century, abolitionists open up, territory for, sort of mere free soilers. I mean, open up, territory for what became the Republican Party. So I think that there's something to that. Now, again, one has to make a judgment. I think there is something to that. Is that, and I credit that. Still, on the other side is the specter of reaction, the specter of, the law and order drumbeat, the specter of the loss in legitimacy that was experienced by people like King and Rustin and those folks. I think, one has to make, I think there's a close judgment to be made, which is why ultimately I don't say, I don't think you can say as a matter of fact, the riots did such and such and such a thing. Yeah, you can make arguments, but social life is so complicated that I think you have to be really careful. That's why I go to my second thing, which is a moral judgment, which is really not dependent on the ultimate upshot of what happened. I mean, I would be just as down, frankly, on the kid who, burned out the neighborhood if you could show that, afterwards the neighborhood got $50 million. I'd still say that what he did was, terrible. But I credit what you're saying. And I'll try to, weave in, because it's a complicated story, and it's a complicated story.
Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. For me, I just want to understand the context from the author's perspectives and the books that you have examined. So it seems to me like you're speaking about two things. First is like the mythicization of history, or the rehistoricization of things that have happened in the past that have been written by these different authors. And then the second thing you're talking about is that it is generational, the ways in which certain people are classified now as cool kids that were not cool kids in the past, and vice versa. So my question is it not the case that certain ideas that eventually flow into text are ideas that emerge from as products of the zeitgeist of the age? And so do you think that it's an aspiration for like total liberation, and that is why people would ask a question, or the author would ask a question, where's our Leonidas? Mm-hmm. So I just want to understand the context that sort of inspires and informs authors to mythicize history. And do you think it's just the zeitgeist, or it's just this person wanting to be slightly controversial?
You know, when you're writing anything, you're writing from where you are. And so the ideas at any particular moment are the ideas that are in the minds of the writer and in the minds of the readers. So it's not like we're ever outside of our historical moment. We are in our historical moment, and you know, that's just the way it is. Now, I do think that different people have different aims, and those aims are really quite important. So I think that there are people who write and they're very self-conscious about it. They write because they want to, they view themselves ultimately as activists, and they want to write something that's going to be a strike for the, you know, for whatever side they're writing for. You know, if they're reactionary, you know, I want to take the country back. If they are progressive, I want to take the country this way. And I think there are people who, you know, they want to write, for instance, a useful history that will be useful for something that they envision. And that's, you know, they might not say something because they say, well, no, I'm not going to say this, because if I say this, you know, my ideological adversary will use it against me. And then you know, they're thinking that way.
Or it's bad for the race.
Bad for the race is an important one.
Self-censorship is a long tradition in black living, and I have railed against this consistently.
Yeah, I mean,
I can't say this in public because it's bad for the race.
I think there's, yeah, and frankly, I think that in a way, that's, again, it seems to me that everyone, even you, will be subject to that. And here's one thing that I grapple with. I kind of think that, or my attitude towards writing articles, writing books, is that I'm not going to have control over this thing once it's published. And that people are going to do what people are going to do. And that people are smart, and frankly, whatever I write is going to be out of my hands. Other people are going to use it the way they want to use it. Now, there's a way in which, for me, and you know, tell me, I find that idea sort of liberating, because therefore, frankly, I'm not so worried. I really don't sort of care, because I feel as though, you know, if somebody wants to use what I've written in a racist way or in a, you know, reactionary way, they're going to use it. And by the way, and if they don't use my thing, they'll use somebody else's thing. So I don't, you know, I'm not worried about it. Knock yourself out. I try to do as best I can to do what I'm doing as possible. Now, I'll add one other thing, which I can imagine somebody thinking that this is a rather effete way of viewing things, but what I'm about to say is somebody says, well, okay, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to, are you trying to write something that will, be a weapon in the hands of, progressives? Sort of, but that's actually not my main thing. The main thing that I want to do is write something that is really interesting.
And true to historical material?
Absolutely true. I want it to be true. I want it to be accurate. I want it to be my knitting. I want it to be a well-knit, accurate thing. But ultimately, I want somebody to read it and be marking in the edges. And geez, I didn't think of that before. And this is, boy, this was a counterintuitive idea. And if I can give, the more interest, the better. Now, again, I can imagine many people whom I deeply respect, saying, oh my gosh, that is not a good way to, invest one's, intellectual energies. I understand that, but I'm just leveling with you and telling you where I am. And if that's sort of effete, if that's sort of, I don't know what, whatever. Maybe it is, but that's what's in my mind. Questions,
May I? Oh, I got the mic. So first, I would like to reiterate, thank you for your being here with us today and engaging us in this conversation. As we are sitting in the Hip Hop Archive, I'm thinking about this notion of, I guess, the violent imagination and its tensions with truth-telling, and how that also shows up very prominently in rap music. In particular, someone like Tupac, who's really lauded for being the truth teller, right, of the Black youth community. Now, so many of his stories, if you sort of research the history, aren't necessarily accurate, right, but are so powerful and so moving. And in particular, just one example is, when Tupac rapped about his court case, right? And I don't know if you all know the line when he says, I opened fire on the judge. And we know in real life that is not what happened. That what happened is that he went through the legal proceedings and he, had his appeal and went through his lawyers, et cetera. But that doesn't make for as powerful of a story, right, as I opened fire and F the judge because she's a liar. And so I wonder if or where or how you see utility in the use of the violent imagination in storytelling within Black histories, and including oral storytelling, especially towards racial justice?
I think we have to be attentive to genre boundaries. I mean, if you're writing a story or writing a novel or writing a song, and you're using your imagination to do this, that, or the other, knock yourself out. And if and it may very well, if you're seeking to horrify and you tell a really horrifying story, strike up the band. You've done a good job. If you're trying to tell a story that induces people to weep, and you can accomplish that, that's various things. What I was talking about, however, was a different genre. It wasn't. What I'm writing, I don't think I can just make up something. It's not putting down people who just make up stuff, because, literary fiction, that's very difficult work. It serves lots of useful purposes, but it's a different activity than what I was talking about.
Thank you for a very engaging talk. I think I want to I want to make a couple of comments, but also echoing the previous comment about, in some ways, having some more nuance on the history. I mean, I appreciate you have another motive. You have your sort of moral judgment motive. But, for example, I think, didn't President Kennedy himself, in his speech announcing the introduction of the Civil Rights Act of 1960, what became the Civil Rights Act of 1964, cite in some ways that summer of violence after Birmingham, which Dr. King called the Negro Revolution, cite this kind of domestic unrest as one of the 3 reasons he gave in that speech for the introduction of that law. So, I mean, I think that that's, in some ways, I'm trying to push against the idea that violent confrontation was, in some ways, marginal to the story of the Second Reconstruction, or to the story, to kind of racial conditions in the 1960s and federal policy. So I feel like in some ways it was much more central, and it was debated at the time. Debated, I think, often from these, from the question of its morality and of its usefulness. And I think there's lots of evidence of that. I think, another key point, especially as the 60s developed, was like the difference between armed self-defense, which a term you've been using, and then sort of armed resistance or armed struggle, especially as they began to think of international, a kind of an internationalism, and the movement grew. So I think there was a lot of attention given to this, and a lot of debates precisely centered around its morality for some, and then its effectiveness for others. I think there's growing evidence, or some evidence, like you cited about the, Ivy League affirmative action, of, Marcia Chatelain's recent book on McDonald's, of like, definitely this violence opening up opportunities in the corporate sphere. So I think it's definitely true that there were major beneficiaries of this violence, but it wasn't for the people who were out in the streets. It was other people. The people, like Elizabeth Hinton's work is increasingly showing that really these were key moments in the kind of drive toward mass incarceration. So so I think there is a lot of nuance there, and I think people at the time were debating this and having a lot of frank discussions around the role of violence in the movement. I also just was, as you were speaking, I was thinking how ironic in some ways it is that today, when we think of violence, of political violence in the United States, it's much more associated with the right. The left, I would say, has repudiated political violence since this period. And so it's kind of interesting that you're noting this sort of historiographical turn, trying to elevate this tradition of armed self-defense or armed resistance, precisely at a time when the social justice movement, the left in the U.S., has pretty much repudiated it. So,
okay. I think there's, on the question of violence, I guess 2 things. One, throughout the history of race relations in the United States, violence has been extremely important, and the deployment of violence that has been, it's been extremely important in advancing the interests of black people. The great irony is, if I had to pick out in what instances was that most true, instance number 1 would be my fellow South Carolinians firing on the Union forces at Fort Sumter. Thank God they did that, generating the Civil War. The ex-Confederates, after the Civil War, so quickly and so blatantly seeking to suppress the former slaves, prompting the deepening of what became Reconstruction. In the second Reconstruction, one of the things that helped tremendously in advancing the interests of black people, and Martin Luther King Jr. in particular used it over and over again, was threats and the actuality of white violence. One thinks of the 4 little girls blown up in Birmingham. That was, I guess, in the fall, in the spring, of course, the attack with the dogs and the hoses on black people, including black children. So, violence, very important, and I'll talk about all of that. On the question of black deployment of violence, because it seemed to me that your first point wasn't that more important than I was suggesting? Maybe so. Maybe I've written down recheck. Maybe it was more important than I have suggested. I'd still stick by my guns and say, okay, maybe it was more important than I've suggested. It certainly wasn't as important as is often being suggested in the historiography now, where people are being put forward as absolutely central who not. If one goes back, I'll push this even, Malcolm X. In the imagination now, Malcolm X, very central figure. Question. In 1964, what was the status of Malcolm X in Black America? If you ask Black Americans, who do you recognize as a leader? Who do you admire? Blah, blah, blah. Where in 1964, where in 1962, 1963, 1964, where would Malcolm X be? Just as a historical matter. Very different than now. Now, one would think if you were a kid taking advanced placement in American history now, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., even Stephen. Go back to 1964 and see, it wasn't like that. And what I'm suggesting is that, or at least one of the things I want to try to do is, on this question of, the zeitgeist, yes, it's very important. When people write things, they often have, current day things that they're trying to do, trying to accomplish. Always. Yes, always, and therefore one always has to be skeptical and test it. You say that so and so was such and such at a given time. Seems like it today. Well, is it true that at that time they were as big a deal as you're suggesting?
I meant consciously or unconsciously.
Go ahead.
It was really the posthumous publication of his autobiography that explains why he became, in some ways, much more famous in the late 60s.
And his
early
assassination.
60s. Yeah, but the autobiography.
Yes.
He was a major impetus in fueling the Black Power movement, right? So that was after he passed away.
I understand that, and you know that. Fine, talk to a 20-year-old who doesn't know that, however. And I'm simply saying that, there are people who, just like, people say things for a particular purpose, as, at a moment. They say things, and, for strategic reasons. They say things for strategic reasons. And people at the time know that they're saying things for strategic reasons. 10 years later, you have new people who come up. They don't know the strategic reason behind what somebody was saying. They just know that they said it, and they embrace it. They believe it. And the motive for why it was said is gone. What was said is the only thing that's in people's minds, and I think we have to, excavate and recapture,
Context.
the context, what was going on in people's minds, at the time, as opposed to memory. Part, I guess, is, there's history and there's memory. There's a relationship between the two, but they're not the same.
Would you take 2 more questions, please?
Yeah, sure.
Then we'll take you to lunch.
Thanks so much for your talk. I would like to preface this by saying I've been uncool my entire life. So,
That's true.
thanks. I was really interested in thinking about, so the two parts of your talk, right, focus on the effectiveness and the morality of what I see as two very different kinds of violent, right? So if we're thinking about self-defense, that comes from a kind of principled strategy, whereas riots are often seen as reactive, right? Like nobody goes out and says, oh, we're having the riot at 2 p.m., like make sure you show up and bring your bats. And so I'm wondering, in judging both the effectiveness and the morality of these things, whether or not the motivation, the impetus, this kind of distinction, what happens when you actually put some pressure to bear on the distinctions between the kinds of violence that you're looking at. And in terms of your conclusions, it seems like self-defense might be moral, but we can't trust the evidence that it could be effective. But riots, there's some evidence that they could be effective maybe in the short term, might be less effective in the long term, but can't be moral either way. And I guess I'm wondering about when you think about drawing attention to these distinctions, whether or not that informs your ideas about effectiveness or morality, and kind of the thing that got me thinking about these things was certainly, I think, an incident that you would think of as being marginal, but for folks who deployed violence not out of necessarily principled self-defense or out of rioting, but because they literally thought of themselves as being at war with the U.S. government, right? Or saw the U.S. government at war, as being at war with Black communities, whether or not thinking about that through the rubric of military action or warfare changes the idea behind the morality of an action, even if its effectiveness. I think most people would agree that those kinds of actions were never effective, right, in pushing Black liberation forward.
Well, there's a lot there, and one does have to be attentive to distinctions, and I've used rather casually, not because of not wanting to be careful. It's just we're here together. We don't have a whole long time, and so you use words. I mean, for instance, self-defense. I mean, that's a very complicated word, and will require some exposition on the page. When people talk about self-defense, that could mean a wide range of things, and in fact, people talked about it meaning a wide range of things. So, there's some people who sort of will say things like, well, here, there's this book, There's a book by Charles Cobb Jr. It's called This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, How Guns Made the Civil Rights Movement Possible. And one of the things that he focuses on, he says, listen, all this talk about nonviolence, but he makes a big thing of the fact that, Martin Luther King Jr. had guns in his house. In fact, somebody said they went to Martin Luther King Jr.'s house in Montgomery, and it was like an arsenal. And he says, people had guns and, carried, and were, said they'd be willing to defend themselves. And so he says, that's why, although nonviolence was crucial to the gains made by the freedom struggle of the 1950s and 1960s, those gains could not have been achieved without the complementary and still underappreciated practice of armed self-defense. Now then we got to talk, well, what does armed self-defense mean? Now, and the people who are writing, some of the time, armed self-defense is is sort of a Black person who has a gun in their house. I mean, okay, that's one thing. And is it the case that people had a gun in their house? Martin Luther King had a gun in his house. Other times they're talking about something something that's considerably different. taking a gun out in public, making a show of the gun, the deployment of violent, rhetoric for various purposes. Again, by the way, it's not like I'm taking the position that the use of violent rhetoric is always bad. For me, it all depends. It all depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Now, I will have a judgment on what you're trying to accomplish. Your last comment about people going to war. By the way, there were people who said, yeah, I'm at war with the United States government. And, and if I can shoot an official, I will. Now, at a certain point when you read about this, one has to, ask certain questions. Okay, well, where do you stand with respect to this? Do you, if you think that the person is justified in taking that position, then from my perspective, you should applaud. You should applaud. On the other hand, you might say, no, that's an unjustified position to take, and that leads you to a very, different set of calculations and a very different set of, ways of talking about the person. And I think all of these things need to be set forth. All of them need to be explored. All of them need to be given a hearing. All I'm saying is, that's right. All of it needs to be out there, and putting it all out there, requires, care, and requires people to be thoroughgoing, and requires people not to be, it requires people to refrain from allowing themselves to be blinded by anything, including sentiment.
One final quick question and quick answer.
So I wanted to double down on corroboration again.
On what?
Corroboration.
Okay, yeah.
To inquire, because it seems to me that you're less interested or less dubious of the preponderance of evidence around the importance of armed revolution, as many would call it from this moment, or armed self-defense. So Gloria Richardson, Robert F. Williams, the family histories of Lorraine Hansberry, Malcolm X, et cetera. Rather, you're less interested in preponderance than form, the form in which that evidence takes as a means of corroborating the kinds of stories you want to tell. And it seems to me that you're interested in it coming either from or through the state and its official archives. And I would like to push back on that form in relationship to other things that have come up already: song, fiction, all of which are formidable forms of evidence, and the prior most especially for me. But thinking about too, my question in part is about methodology. Someone like Saidiya Hartman or the Black feminist historians who have developed these ways of reading that tell far fuller stories than what the state can possibly accomplish, right? Recognizing the impossibility of the state actually documenting Black life fully. And so it's a question about methodology and form by which we get to this corroboration. And then just quickly, I have a question about the broader project. Do criminal defense attorneys play any role in this story from your perspective? Do you write about them in the book?
I'll answer the last question first. Yeah, I talk in my book. I'll be talking a lot about attorneys, including criminal defense attorneys, and or attorneys of all sorts, but including criminal defense attorneys. I mean, the most important lawyer of the era was a lawyer who was, quite an excellent criminal defense attorney, namely Thurgood Marshall. And there were others, of course. And the stories about attorneys are really, there are a bunch of really interesting racial stories surrounding attorneys. Two white attorneys immediately come to mind, for instance, about whom there was a tremendous controversy, and I think a very ironic, very interesting controversy. One was Jack Greenberg. So Jack Greenberg succeeds Thurgood Marshall as the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund.
Instead of Constance Baker Motley.
Instead of Constance Baker Motley, or Robert Carter. Robert Carter, you know. And there were a lot of people who were really pissed off about that. And again, you know, memories. I mean, people were really angry. You know, there were bunches of black attorneys who were very angry about that, did not like that. But there was a controversy about it. It's sort of interesting that within the NAACP, so you know the NAACP thoroughly, here's your thoroughly sort of integrationist-minded group, but there were black lawyers with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the NAACP who took a very strong position and said, you know, there was a reason why people in Mississippi came from miles around to see Constance Baker Motley argue on behalf of James Meredith. It was an inspiration for them just to see a black attorney, much less a black woman attorney. And that inspirational quality, you know, there's no white attorney who, you know, God bless him, he's great, but there's no white attorney who can sort of do that. And so there were people who said that, and there was a really interesting, you know, dispute about that. Criminal defense attorney Charles Gary was the main defense attorney for the Black Panther Party, and there were people who really criticized the Black Panther Party. Why is it Black Panther Party, you've got this white attorney, Charles Gary.
And Kunstler.
And Kunstler, but Gary in particular. Right. And the Black Panther Party, I gotta give it, the Black Panther Party wrote in the Black Panther newspaper a sizzling response, basically saying, damn right, he's our attorney, he is, you know, and we're not distancing ourselves. He's our main man. And they went on to talk about, you know, why it was that they embraced Charles Gary, and as far as they were concerned, you know, he was a brother through and through. Well, I thought it was sort of interesting that in, you know, these two debates. Now, on the methodology point, yes, I think it is a very difficult thing. I think corroboration is a very difficult thing. And, you know, one of the reasons why I wanted to, I'm really concerned about this part of my book is because so much of my book is about what happens in courtrooms, what happens in legislatures. And so if that's what, you know, so much of my topic is about, it naturally pushes me to talking about, you know, lawyers, legislators, lobbyists, those sorts of people, and puts off to the margins the people who have been talking about a lot here. I think the problem of corroboration, you know, where do you get your information from? So for instance, you know, the New York Times didn't cover a whole lot of stuff. And it's a big mistake. You make a big mistake if you peg your history according to what the New York Times covers. There's a lot of stuff that the New York Times does not cover. History does not begin when the New York Times editors decide to send a reporter someplace. So I take what you're saying about methodology and the problem of corroboration. I think one has to be creative. That's why I do not, you know, I'm not saying down with oral history. I'm not saying, you know, I think you should go wherever you can get good evidence. You know, maybe a short story, maybe a poem. I think the good evidence can be gotten lots of different ways. I'm simply saying demand good evidence and don't rest with getting information that accords with your point of view, and so you stop and you just say, well, you know, I'm going to say that that's a fact. No, that's the information that you have. You interpret it, but you also recognize its limitations.
When I think of Randy, who's a very, very dear friend, obviously, two words always come to mind consistently: conscience and courage. Let's thank Randy Kennedy for
Thanks a lot, Skip. Thank you, man. Yeah. Be good.
Let's have lunch.
Okay.
The fellows and our guest speaker and introducer will prepare for Indian food for lunch. All the rest of y'all got to get out of here. Thanks for coming. Hope to see you next week.